Assalamu alaikum. So majority of the discourses here, especially in the third volume, they might be a little bit too too intense and too much in depth without a reasoning. So I tend to, I would say, just skim over a lot of the stuff that I don't find a necessity, and this is not a classical course in which we go through like every single chapter and like try to understand what the writer is trying to say at all. This majority of this is basically side notes, annotations around the discourses that are discussed in this book, and then of course, some of my input and my thoughts on the issues. And you sometimes really have to appreciate the depth that Muhammad Baqir Sadr goes into, because it could get very intense very quickly. Nonetheless, last lecture we spoke about the actual hukum and the apparent hukum. And we said that there is no way for us to get the verdict in actuality. If you guys remember in the first cycle of these things, and even in Ma'alim al-Jadid, that introduction that's available like on alislam.org, it's available in English. Muhammad Baqir Sadr has this view, and it's an interesting view, and some might say it's not even controversial, but I'll show you where the controversy comes in. The view is that the legislator, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, before he gives a declaration that something is haram or something is wajib, there must be a reason for that. And so Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he sees what benefits there are in doing such an action, or what harm is there in doing a particular action. And based on that, he will come up with a verdict. If the benefit is so high that you cannot do without it, he will make it an obligation. And if it's so harmful that you must avoid it, he will make it prohibited. And we see that the legislators, human legislators of today, when the lawmakers decide to make a law, they also follow this trend that if something is way too beneficial, then you must make it an obligation, such as paying your taxes. And if something is very harmful, you make it prohibited, such as murder. And this is very rational, and it keeps on going. Now, where does this fall when we say that we have two types of verdicts, the apparent verdict and the actual verdict? All of this that Muhammad Baqir Sadr said about the benefits and the disadvantages is all correct, provided that you have access to the actual verdict. If you don't have access to the actual verdict and you are only focusing on the apparency of the evidence to come up with the verdict, then the benefits and disadvantages of a particular action must fall. And this is very important. So, for example, and we have this a lot, where somebody would ask, why is pork haram? And someone says, medicine said this is bad and this thing is horrible for you and blah, 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 blah. Or alcohol is haram because 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Meanwhile, the true reason of why the fatwa, the declaration came out that this is haram, is because the apparency of the evidence said it was haram. Had there been other evidence to suggest otherwise, the declaration would have been otherwise. So the benefits and disadvantages of the action play no resemblance in our fiqh today, because we lack the capability of reaching the actual verdict. We only have access to the apparent verdict. And this goes, even if we were to, it's not subject to our time. If we were to, let's say, live at the time of the Prophet and we heard from the Prophet saying a declaration, our hearing is evidence of apparency and not actuality. What's the possibility that you misheard? Maybe a big possibility. What if you heard correctly but you misunderstood? You're limited to your understanding. So the actuality of the verdict is missing. We don't know the actual verdict at all times. Because we are not infallible, we do not have access to the actual verdict, but we have access to the apparency of the evidence. Now, that being said, we have a very interesting paradox that we fall into. We know that there's 4 sources in Islam that we capture or we consider as reliable evidence to come up with a declaration. The first one being the Quran, second one being the Sunnah, third one being the rationale, and the fourth one being the ijma' of the Ummah. And again, we will discuss, God knows how long this is going to take us, but we will discuss the sources and see, can we add more to these sources? Can we subtract some of the sources? What's the reasoning of these sources? Who came up with these sources to begin with? So that's besides the point. The rationale dictates, and remember the rationale, especially in Shia Usool, is very limited because we don't allow qiyas, and that's a whole subject in itself. But the rationale dictates that something cannot be haram and wajib at the same time, because that's basically 2 contradicting things meeting each other at the same point, and that is completely irrational to begin with. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala can't say it is wajib for you to pray and haram for you to pray at the same time. And that sounds good, it makes a lot of sense, sounds great. The problem falls where? When we have 2 types of hukum, an actual hukum and an apparent hukum. And it is not only possible, it is probably the case so many times that the apparent hukum is directly the opposite of the actual hukum. Let's say, for example, a faqih comes and he says this thing is wajib, and in actuality it is haram. If that is the case, now we fell into this paradox that something now is is wajib and haram at the same time. For example, let's give an actual example. Salat al-Layl, for example. Salat al-Layl, majority of our fuqaha say it is mustahab. Okay. In actuality, it may be in actuality that it is wajib. And somebody can say the evidence based on the Quran, it has a way of being wajib, for example. Very amateur example, but follow me with it. Now, let's say somebody says it's haram, such as in Salat al-Jum'ah. Salat al-Jum'ah, we have all 5 fatwas, mashallah. We have fuqaha that say it's wajib, we have fuqaha that say it's makruh, we have fuqaha that say it's mustahab, we have fuqaha that say it's haram, fuqaha that say it's mubah, and fuqaha that say it's wajib takhiri, optional wajib. So we got very creative with Salat al-Jum'ah. Now, in actuality, there's one hukum on Salat al-Jum'ah. Now, how can it be that these 2 contradict? That means Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is commanding you to follow the evidence. And the evidence tells you that Salat al-Jum'ah is haram, for example. And in actuality, in the Day of Judgment, when you go there, you found out that Salat al-Jum'ah was wajib. This contradiction, having these types of hukum, right? The actual and the apparent, causes a huge rational paradox, because number one, we have to throw away the theory of benefits and disadvantages of why or the reasoning behind law, and now we only following the evidence. Now the evidence can contradict actuality, creates a very big problem. So this, the scholars try to, weasel around to try to explain this issue. However, one of the strongest opinions on the matter is that the apparent hukum is always the actual hukum for you, regardless of what it is in actuality. That means basically we know for certain that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to follow the Quran, and we know for certain Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala told us to follow the Sunnah, and we know for certain that the single narrator is Hujjah, and we know, pretending that all of our fundamentals are correct, let's say, and we know them to the level of certainty. Then the apparency is your actual hukum. So the hukum waqi and hukum zahiri become the same. That means there is no actual hukum in the outside. The hukum is always apparent. That's one way to look at it. The second one, which is Muhammad Baqir Sadr goes to, and he says the ahkam are one thing, the actual hukum is one thing, and our purpose in following the law is something else. Muhammad Baqir Sadr is of the theory of Munajjaziyya and Mu'adhariyya,